Hello, I am James Joseph Dresnock, and I would like to share my story with you. I served as an American soldier stationed on the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea during the Cold War. Contrary to previous reports, I did not simply decide to walk over the line to the north and defect, betraying my country. That was never my intention. The truth is that I was captured by the North Koreans while on patrol and held as a prisoner of war. During my captivity, I was subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torture, including brainwashing. This eventually led me to make false confessions and denounce my loyalty to the United States. After being released in a prisoner exchange, I chose to remain in North Korea, believing that I had no place in the country I'd once called home. My defection was not a choice I made freely, but rather a result of the trauma and manipulation I endured while in captivity. As for my childhood, I was born on November 24, 1941, and raised in Richmond, Virginia. My parents had a tumultuous relationship with constant arguments over money. When my mother left my father, she took my brother and me with her, and we became homeless, traveling from place to place. Eventually, my mother lost custody of us, and I was sent to live with an aunt who did not want the responsibility of raising me. I felt unwelcome in her home and ran away frequently. My father eventually took me back, but by that time he had remarried and lied to his new wife about having 2 sons. After a heated argument with his new wife, my father dropped me off at a retirement home, claiming we were visiting an elderly relative. He never returned, and I was left alone and orphaned. I resorted to stealing to survive, but I was caught and sent to a children's home run by Pastor C.T. Overstreet, who the kids nicknamed Big Papa. I loved spending time at the orphanage and finally felt as though I'd been welcomed into a surrogate family. I made friends with some of the other orphans, including a boy named Sonny Jeter, who later described my jazz knock. I had absolutely nothing except for the clothes on my back. For children who are born in my situation, there are very few work opportunities. My parents had often kept me out of school for so long when I was young that I had a very hard time catching up to my peers. During an interview years later, I claimed that I was illiterate, though it may have been an exaggeration. I enlisted in the US Army at 17 years old because it was the best chance for me to have any kind of career or learn a life skill. I believed that by joining the Army, I would have more freedom to travel the world and have options in a career. But unfortunately, what I felt was the exact opposite. The Army had strict rules and regulations. They controlled where I would be stationed and for how long. Drill sergeants were yelling at me constantly, and I realized that what I actually wanted was a normal life with a wife and children. I wanted that idea of the perfect American dream and the happy little family that I never got to have as a kid. During a short leave from the Army, I went back to Virginia. I was now 18 years old and married a young woman that I met at church named Kathleen Ringwood. We had only known each other for a short period of time before the Army stationed me in West Germany for 2 years. I was separated from my wife for so long that she cheated on me. When I was away, I received a rather cold letter from her in the mail saying that she had found a new lover and wanted a divorce. During an interview, I bitterly mentioned the fact that I'd had so many opportunities to cheat on Kathleen while I was stationed in Germany, and that most soldiers hired prostitutes. But I remained celibate for over 2 years because I was loyal to her. I must have felt that all of the images of the happy American families of the 1950s and 1960s were just propaganda. If the American dream existed, I couldn't find it. I returned to Virginia just long enough to file the paperwork for divorce. Without anything keeping me there, I decided to re-enlist in the Army for another term. I said the time I left Richmond, I was fed up. I didn't want nothing. If I died or lived, I didn't care. The Korean War had been over for more than a decade, and yet the fighting had never stopped. There is a 2.5-mile wide, 125 miles long stretch of land between North and South Korea, which is known as the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ for short. In 1962, I was stationed at the DMZ, and I was shocked at the fact that even in times of peace, I very well may die defending the border. I was incredibly depressed and had lost any hope for a future outside of the army, so I decided to spend all of the money that I earned hiring prostitutes in the South Korean villages and drinking. I was now 20 years old, and my days were an endless cycle of taking orders, doing the bare minimum effort, and letting loose as soon as I could take time off. One night I wanted to go and see one of my girlfriends, but my commanding officers would not allow me to leave whenever I felt like it. I was so fed up with having to obey orders all the time that I forged my sergeant's signature on a pass and snuck out to the village at night. The next morning, August 15, 1962, one of my commanding officers, Captain Thomas Bryan, was trying to reprimand me for sneaking out. I snapped, "You can't touch me." I had a pass, but obviously Captain Bryan wasn't stupid. He already knew that I had forged the signature. He told me to come back to his office at 3:00 p.m. and planned to file the charge sheets and have me caught. I felt as if I had absolutely no future, especially since I had no money to my name and no home to go to. In the distance, North Korea had built a city that they called the Peace Village. They played music and urged South Koreans to defect so that they could enjoy the beautiful communist country. From my perspective, it looked far more advanced compared to South Korea. That same day, during lunch break, I snuck out. It was still broad daylight, and I began walking down the road towards North Korea. I knew that there were landmines all around me, but I cared so little about my own life that I was willing to take the risk. Once the Americans noticed that I was leaving, they started to shout after me to come back. I turned around and shot into the air, which scared everyone. They believed that I had gone a wall and was trying to attack them. I continued walking quickly towards North Korea, and I never looked back. I was afraid, but at the same time, life wasn't so precious. The North Korean soldiers were stationed on their side of the DMZ, and from their perspective, they saw a very tall and powerful-looking white man coming towards them. They were all ordered to take battle stations, and a group of soldiers surrounded me. They pointed their guns and their nets at me. It was clear from the way that they looked at me that many of them wanted to kill me on the spot. This was the American monster they had been warned about. The squad commander told them all to calm down. They blindfolded me and they took me back to their base. I was interrogated, and I calmly complied with answering all of their questions without resistance. Since I was just a private first class, I did not know anything that the North Koreans themselves didn't already know. The next morning, I awoke to a voice speaking to me in English. "Dresnock, Dresnock." Still half asleep, I probably thought everything had been a bad dream. It turns out that I was not the first American soldier who had chosen to defect to North Korea. A young man named Larry Allen Abstier had a similar backstory to mine, except that he was in trouble because he was caught smoking the wild marijuana that grew on the North Korean border. I became fed up with the rules and decided to cross the border. Later, Jerry Wayne Parrish defected as well. In 1963, North Korea began sending paper flyers over the border of the DMs, offering financial incentives for Americans who brought them weapons and secrets. This convinced a man named Sergeant Charles Robert Jenkins to defect in 1965, and he showed up carrying an M14 rifle. He was given an award and a celebration in front of a large crowd. The government tried to use us as examples that the United States and South Korea must be an awful place to live if we were willing to flee the country. I began to tell the North Korean people about the dark history of American slavery and how so many people became homeless despite their hard work. Since I was so willing to participate in their propaganda, the North Koreans asked me to speak over the loudspeakers in English. I started to say that if more American soldiers came over to North Korea, they would be treated like kings. But living in North Korea, it wasn't all sunshine. It was very uncomfortable for us to live as the only white people in the entire country, especially since propaganda had taught us that Americans were evil. We could not walk down the street without people staring at us and whispering. We were not allowed to marry any of the North Korean women, and we quickly realized that it would be impossible to have a normal life. Absher, Parrish, Jenkins, and I all agreed that it was time to plan an escape. In 1966, all four of us decided that it was time to leave. We visited the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang, asking for asylum so that we could be transferred to live in the Soviet Union. I thought because they were white people too, they would accept. But the Russians didn't treat us well. They notified the Korean government and we were taken back into custody. According to me, the Koreans did not punish us for trying to leave. In fact, they felt guilty that they had made us feel so unwelcome and decided it was time to try harder to educate us on how to speak Korean and learn the ways of their culture. Compared to how I was treated for my mistake in the US Army, I felt very grateful for their mercy and understanding. Keep in mind that at this time, North Korea was actually making more economic progress compared to South Korea. Back in South Korea, most people were still living in extreme poverty and working as farmers. Pyongyang had skyscrapers, a sports stadium, and plenty of smiling, happy people. Seeing this spectacular city was proof that communism really just may be the better choice compared to capitalism. Without any contact with the outside world, we had no way of knowing that the United States had been able to go to the moon or any of the other accomplishments that were going on in our home country. We were told that it was in the best interest of everyone if we lived separately from average North Korean people. I had minders who would come to ask me every day if I needed anything, like personal servants that would go to the supermarkets and retrieve anything that I might need. If I wanted to go anywhere, I would be chauffeured directly to these places. I lived every day like it was an extended vacation. I would read novels, go for a swim in the river, smoke cigarettes, drink, gamble, and tell stories about life back in America. To me, it was everything I ever wanted. This was my definition of freedom. I felt as though I was being treated like a king. However, Sergeant Charles Jenkins did not share my sentiment. He felt like a prisoner who had failed his first attempt at escape and believed that our mission was not yet complete. Being the highest-ranking officer among us, Jenkins assumed the role of our leader. He tried to tell the three younger men what they should do and what they shouldn't. This made the other two men happy. They were used to being given orders in the army, and they probably felt some comfort to have an older man telling them that they would continue planning their escape. But I didn't like being bossed around. I got into a fistfight with Jenkins and punched him until he fell on the ground. After this incident, the other men started to isolate themselves from me. In 1972, we were fluent enough in speaking Korean to have full North Korean citizenship. We were allowed to leave our compound and have our own apartments, food rations, and transportation. The leader's son, Kim Jong-il, had not taken his father's place as the new dictator, even though such things were forbidden to the average citizen. I'll indulged in Hollywood movies, and it was his dream to become a film director. Of course, if you're the son of the dictator, you can do whatever you want. Kim Jong-il needed someone to play the villains, and that's where we American men came in. In 1978, all four of us starred in a 20-part drama called Unsung Heroes. I played a character named Arthur. Kim Jong-il explained to his people that in order to portray a villain effectively, an actor needs to have a lot of patriotism for their country. After hearing this, North Korean people stopped thinking of us American defectors as the enemy and began to see us as national heroes. Now, when I went out in public, people began to address me as Arthur, and they happily gave me free food, drinks, and gifts. In the 1980s, I began to teach English classes at the University of Pyongyang. Most of the information we struggled to get from the outside world about advances in science and technology were written in English, so my help was actually vital to their translations. One evening, I went to a restaurant and spotted a beautiful brunette woman named Duina Bumbi. She was the first European woman I'd seen in years, so I began to talk to her. I wasted no time in asking her out on a date, and she agreed. We ended up getting married and having 2 children. Later on, it was revealed that Duina Bumbia may have been kidnapped by the North Korean government and planted in the restaurant with the intention of setting us up together. However, I claim that she was there by choice even years later. In 2014, her brother Gabriel Bumbia demanded answers at the UN Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, her family was never allowed to communicate with her, so they never knew if she was kidnapped or if she chose to defect. She passed away from lung cancer before she could see her loved ones again. Larry Allen Abshare, one of our group members, married a Thai woman named Anoka Pandroy. She worked as a massage therapist in Bangkok, but one day she left the apartment to get her hair done and never came back. Her friends and family never knew that she had been kidnapped and was living in North Korea. Larry Abshir passed away in 1983 from a heart attack at 40 years old. During the 1990s, Kim Jong-il became dictator and there was a huge famine in North Korea known as the Arduous March. No one knows how many people died during this time, but some estimate it to be in the millions. As we became celebrities and members of the elite class, we never had to give up our food rations or suffer like the lower class people. I and my two sons, Theodore and James, grew up and attended the foreign language college in Pyongyang. During my interview with the BBC, I stated that if I had stayed in the United States, I would never have been able to afford to send my children to college, and I had no regrets for defecting. After the death of my first wife, I went back to the same restaurant and met my third wife. Her father was a diplomat from the Tongues Republic and had a Korean woman pregnant. As a mixed-race woman, she was seen as undesirable for Korean men to marry. So I married her, and we had a child together, James Wayne Parrish. Another member of our group married a woman named Sayanu Shrita from Lebanon and eventually passed away. She was still alive during the BBC documentary and stated that she came to North Korea as a tourist, fell in love with Parrish, got pregnant and decided to stay. According to her, she was never kidnapped and was happy living in North Korea. Parrish died in 1998 at the age of 54. Charles Jenkins and I were the only two American defectors left from our original group. Even after all those years, we were still at odds. I loved life in North Korea, but Jenkins still felt very much like a prisoner. In 1980, Jenkins met a 21-year-old Japanese woman named Hitoma Soga. She was not afraid to bluntly tell him that she had been kidnapped and wanted to go home. In 1980, when Jenkins was 40, he met a 21-year-old Japanese woman named Hitomi Soga who had been kidnapped and wanted to go home. She told Jenkins bluntly about her kidnapping and they bonded over their homesickness. Eventually, they fell in love and got married, living in an apartment next to Anoka Panjoy, another kidnapped woman who had become a close friend to them. Panjoy was eventually able to escape after marrying an East German diplomat, and the North Korean government allowed her to leave. In 2002, the North Korean government showed mercy to Hitomi Soga and several other Japanese women who had been kidnapped and allowed them to go back to Japan to visit their family. They were supposed to return to North Korea, but they never did. In 2004, the Japanese government was able to help reunite Charles Jenkins with Hitomi Soga and two daughters. Finally, they were able to escape and move to Japan. After escape, Jenkins wrote an autobiography called To Tell the Truth, in which he claimed that the North Korean government had turned me into their muscle and that I beat him bloody on at least 30 different occasions. He also claimed that they cut off the skin of all my US Army tattoos without using anesthetic. While I admit to the tattoo part of the story and revealed my scars during a documentary, I deny the other claims. Jenkins also claimed that the government wanted all of us to give birth to foreign children who were loyal to North Korea so that they could become spies. I continued to deny all of Jenkins' claims, saying that he was simply playing up the situation to sell his book. My two sons, Theodore and James, are now grown men and have taken their father's place, playing American villains in North Korean films. I died in 2016 at 74 years old. President George Walker Bush was asked to make a decision on what to do about Jenkins' defection in the 1960s. After hearing the whole story, Bush decided that Jenkins would serve just 30 days in prison and his rank was demoted to private. Jenkins was granted Japanese citizenship in 2008. Despite the fact that we were manipulated into being together, Jenkins and Hitomi truly did love each other because they stayed together for the rest of his life. Jenkins died in 2017 at 77 years old. Unfortunately, we may never know the whole truth about what happened behind closed doors. It's possible that Jenkins and I truly had vastly different views of an almost identical situation, or perhaps one of us was brainwashed by the North Koreans. Let us know in the comments what you think, and please subscribe for more videos just like this. Also, give us a like if you enjoyed it.